history of, I mean, in the 60s is when it really came about, and there was some having a spending cap in the 30s that needed a 2/3 vote to change that as well. So there's some good history, I think, with the budgeting or with changing that. But Jim, what do you think on the 2/3? Is it something that you think they certainly should look at in the convention?
It should be looked. It certainly should be, because we, as you said, we're one of 3 states that have that. So we're either a lot smarter than the other 47 or not. This is clearly, part of the issues that we have. You need to have a budget, and you need to have it on time. Fred and California Forward are proposing a 2-year budget cycle. Some states do that. That may make sense. We have, it's been said, Dan Walters, who's the esteemed veteran of capital reporting from the Sacramento Bee, says we actually have a budget cycle. We have 3 budgets a year now. I think he may be underestimating. So we've had several in this 5-month budget cycle. This isn't going to work for us. It's resulted in us having the lowest bond rating in the country. That costs us billions of dollars, and it's untenable. You need to have a budget that's predictable, on time, either every year or every 2 years. If the revenues aren't there to support it, you have to be able to get back in there and have the legislature make the decision. I think the problems with getting to a budget are largely a function of the partisanship that's up there. But one way or another, you have to have a system that forces the decision to get made, and I think you have to associate it with some form of generally accepted accounting principles, so that you're not basing your budget on revenues you can't reasonably expect. Here we are, a little ways into the year, and we're $6 billion in the hole for the current year. You can't tell me people didn't know this was happening when you signed the deal.
And that's really part of the problem. And I think that in Fred's, the 2-year budget cycle is tremendous, and the performance-based budgeting is something that's necessary so that we can kind of control those expenses in the next year out. And it's true with the budget that went on. But the 2/3, what resulted in Sacramento, is more of the budget being held hostage by 1 or 2 of those rogue or maverick legislators who want to try and extort what they can out of the system for their district or for themselves. And in the last budget, I mean, it cost $50 million or whatever it was when you took those minority vote individuals who were adding to get to that 2/3. Now, maybe you could say you're always going to have that if it needs 55%. There's going to be someone that's going to be that last vote that you're going to need to make it happen. So it is a problem today, because you do get to that point where extortion sets in, and whether it's coming from an individual member or it comes from, and I don't want to use the word extortion, from the governor's office, where the pressure is there as well to try and create things that really should be more through a budget process, a longer, more methodical and thoughtful budget process through committee hearings where the public can input into it. So, but Fred, what are your thoughts? I didn't give you a chance to respond to that in the state budget.
Sure. On the vote requirement, this is all about the politics of budget making and the politics of the budgetary process. There are 8 states that have some form of a supermajority. There are 3, as you identified, that have a straight 2/3 on the budget, but they have exceptions. California actually has an exception. That 2/3 vote does not apply to school appropriations. It hasn't since the 1930s. So there are all these variations. A couple of states have a 2/3 vote based on the amount of spending growth. So if it's under a certain amount, it's a majority vote. If it's over a certain amount, it's a 2/3 vote. So we have all these variations. In the end, it's all about legislators and governors reaching conclusions about spending priorities. And so the vote requirement in and of itself is not a magic elixir to fix things. I think Jim and Connie had made that point, that you need to take it as a part of a larger set of reforms, which is why we've suggested that if you take a set of reforms, that having a majority vote on the budget would work, and so that's why we've suggested that we ought to go to a majority vote. If you go to a multi-year financing system, you have a pay-go method for new programs. You take the spikes in revenue out and put them in reserves, that you go to performance-based budgeting, that a majority vote on the budget would make sense.
That's very good. I think that the tough part, as Jim mentioned, is to get the legislature to agree on that majority vote bill. And in the struggle that we're looking at internally is it takes a 2/3 vote of the legislature to put an initiative on the ballot, and then it only takes a majority of the voters to agree to that to bring it forward. And that's the challenge. So my assumption is that if the legislature were to be able to lower that threshold, the cost would be fairly high, I would think, to that minority party or whoever doesn't want to see that.
You had said, and I guess I would disagree, that it's just a couple of rogues that it takes to hold it up. It's actually the whole minority party that's holding it up, and they think it's a couple of rogues that go to the other side eventually and give in for at some price that $25 million you talk about in order to get the budget passed. I think one of the things that's happening in Sacramento is that the minority party, and it could be either party at any time, in the most recent iteration, but not historically, has been set aside. And so during the course of the year, the minority party doesn't chair any of the committees. They operate on distinct minorities on the committees. And when budget time comes, this 2/3 vote gets to be an awful lot more important than it should be. Historically, the legislature used to pass the budget with a 95, 98% vote. They actually owned the budget. They worked it out together. They figured out they did what they had to do. They got a budget. Today, it's obviously much different than that, and they're using that budget moment, that 2/3 moment, because that's basically all they've got to be able to report back to their constituencies that they were able to get anything or do anything or be relevant in our state capital. So I think you have to look at that as well as a real factor.
Jim, you're raising a very good point, because that's one of the observations that I've made over the past year that I've been there, and it's been shocking to see, when coming from a county and an area that's very collaborative and nonpartisan or bipartisan, I guess you'd say, everyone gets together and looks at the common good and what the solution they can work together on. And in Sacramento, it doesn't work that way. You're right. The minority party does not chair a committee. They don't get the money for offices that the majority party gets. They generally don't get the size of the offices that they're the staffing, and the bills. One day we voted on 100 bills. And of the 100, 3 of them were minority party bills that were initiated by that, and they were of less significance than those, and that has to change. And I've been working to try and change that, because I come from that from this foundation, and my frame of reference is different.
If you change that, you wouldn't have the problem with the budget
and I agree
as much.
I think so. But I think going back, the term limits has created some of that angst among the members who were there for that 6-year period of time in the Assembly, or the 8 years in the Senate. And the partisanship is to try and make sure that you can build your party up to whatever level that you want to get within those areas. A couple of other areas in governance that we've got that we see. I know that in the Joint Select Committee hearings on improving state government that we've had, some of the discussion has been on, as you know, in the Assembly, in terms of voting. You can change your vote at the end, and you get 40 bills that you can introduce and author in a 2-year cycle, of reducing some of that to make it more significant in some of the areas, and to put more transparency into the system. I mean, I think we could all probably agree that that's a good thing to do. But what I'd like to do is kind of go back to the term limit issue again. Where do you think? Do you think we should have term limits at some form? Do you think they're good, or as some people say, the electorate every 2 years or every 4 years, that's the term limit, and the voters can throw you out? It doesn't work that way, we know. But I know that's been some of the thoughts. So, Jim, what do you think?
They're not working the way they were created. What we had before was people holding the speakership. Willie Brown, I mean, the term limits was created to get Willie Brown out of the speakership. People chairing committees for more than a decade and so forth, and people didn't like that. And the response was to create what we've got. And clearly in the Assembly, where one only gets 3 2-year terms, where you serve, you come into the Assembly, you're new, you're ready to go, but you don't have the experience to chair a committee, and yet you may find yourself doing just that. And so you become beholden more to the information provided by lobbyists, special interest groups, staff.